What can you see? Can you see my slides there?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
not full screen yet, Nicole.
It's not full screen. No. Let me do that. Okay. Is that showing correctly?
Yep,
Yeah,
great.
it does.
Okay, beautiful. All right. So today our topic is research ethics. And so we want to talk a little bit about power, harm, consent, anonymity, and safety when we're trying to produce inclusive research. So these are some of the themes that we're touching on today, and the three objectives that for this part, and maybe for the whole session, but certainly for this part, is to understand the various factors that have to be addressed if we're going to produce ethical research. I'll say a little bit about why ethical research is important, because I mean, you can produce unethical research too, but I think increasingly it's important for us to think about, both the ethics of, or how to respect ethical principles when we're designing our research, but also what happens to our research. And increasingly, as researchers, when we look to disseminate our research, we will be asked about the ethical processes that we have undertaken. And very often, say, for example, in my experience, publishing research, often you are asked to show the ethics protocols. We have a very official process in the university system here and in many countries, and you have to demonstrate that you have put your research through and had approval from an ethics committee. So these principles are becoming more institutionalized, and it's very important for us to internalize them as researchers. So what factors do we have to address? And then I'm going to talk about some strategies that can be built into your research process to make sure you're addressing these protocols, ethics protocols, and really get you thinking about the extent to which ethics should inform the research process from the moment of design through to implementation and then the write-up phase. So sometimes people sort of have the impression that you do the ethics process at the end of your research, but that is not at all what should be happening. You need to build the ethics, respect for the ethics principles and ethics protocols into your research design right from the beginning, and it will shape how that your project evolves consequently. So I'm going to go through each of these sort of areas in a little bit of detail. And the first one is managing power dynamics in research. I have gender there, but these principles are relevant to the conduct of all research that we do with human subjects, right? So we're talking about social science research in our training. So why and how do we need to think about power dynamics when we're developing research? So like every other domain of life, power relations have implications for how we undertake research. So as soon as we walk into a community with a pen and a piece of paper and start asking questions, even if it's our own community, the dynamics of our relationship with people in that community will change a little bit. That's certainly been my own experience here in Brisbane. I might have related this story before. I conducted research in my own neighborhood with people who experienced a very bad environmental disaster, which I also experienced as someone who lost, whose home was inundated very seriously by floodwaters in 2011 here in Brisbane. So I was a flood affected person, and I did research in my community with other flood affected people. But even though they were often my friends or we had gone through the same experiences, once I started to do interviews with them, being in a similar situation gave me certain sorts of access. People trusted me a little bit more, but they were still very guarded because suddenly I was not just exchanging conversation with them about our situation and how we were coping, I was actually recording the responses. So it's interesting to note that even if you are very close to those you conduct research with, the dynamics can change quite considerably once you start, as I said, going in with a note pen and a notepad and a pen and start recording, or maybe tape recording what you're doing. And of course, that is significant if we're researching with people who are not from our own community. So even though we may share nationality, or you may share nationality as Cambodians in looking to do research with people from your own country, those dynamics I think are still quite important depending on who you're working with. Now, if we have institutional backing, if we have, say we come from a research institute, or we have the security of employment and we're conducting research for a government agency, that may also mean that we have a different power dynamic to those we're seeking to engage in our research as participants. So we need to also be careful about how we negotiate the terms of participation with those we're hoping to work with. And we need to be careful that we are not engaging into a relationship where people feel like they are coerced into agreeing to become participants in our research. Now, we may not feel powerful in our workplaces, or because of our institutional backing, we may not feel powerful, but people from other settings may perceive us as powerful. So it's important to think about why people say yes to research. They may feel that they have to say yes because they perceive people coming in as having more power. And then that can also be quite damaging for our research results, because if people don't feel that they have autonomy in this relationship with a researcher, they may also feel that they want to please the researcher. They want to tell the researcher what they think the researcher wants to know. So it can be damaging for the results, but it can also just be damaging for the way the research is conducted. And if people do feel coerced to participate, then, we could say that that research is actually unethical. So we need to limit the extent to which people feel coerced. So when I say coerced, they feel pressure to participate in the research. We also need to be careful that we're working with people. Sometimes you might, say you want to conduct research in a particular workplace, for example, or a particular village, and you need to negotiate some kind of permission from a figure of authority. We call those figures often in the research process gatekeepers, right? So we need to negotiate the permission of a gatekeeper figure. What we need to be careful about there is the extent to which that gatekeeper is also using their authority to skew the research process. So for example, a gatekeeper in a workplace who might be a manager might say, yes, you can come and do research, but then they decide who are the participants in the research, and their aim in that sort of process is to make sure that all the participants say what a good manager they are, right? Or how great the company is and how well looked after. And so they screen the participants first to make sure that the people who might give more negative sort of insights, or offer more negative insights of their experience as an employee within a particular work site, are not given the chance to participate. So it's, again, those negotiations of power can be really often hidden, but we need to be aware of them and work out how we locate gatekeepers that are going to be transparent, or how we develop a relationship of recruitment, with the authority of the gatekeeper to ensure that the results from the research aren't skewed in a particular way. Please, if you have any questions, or put them in the chat, or we can follow up at the end. I haven't got too many slides today, but or raise your hand. I'm happy to answer questions. Maybe Moani can just keep an eye on what's happening there with anybody who has questions and so forth, or we'll certainly have some discussion when I finish. So as I said, managing the power dynamics in research is very important, and ethical research tries to minimize the impacts of these power differentials between the researcher and the researched person. It also tries to minimize the prospects for harm, which is a second really important consideration that I'm going to come back to. So when we so some of the principles that we are developing with this in the stage of recruiting participants is to make sure that people consent freely to participation in research. As I said, that people are not coerced into research participation. So for example, another example, and we do this often in social science research, and I think it's actually quite important, when we're working with people in very economically vulnerable situations, often we offer them a little payment for their time or an exchange of a gift, or you might buy them even just a snack or a drink or something to thank them for their time and to recognize that they're giving up something to help you, right? So that's quite important, I think. But we also need to be careful that that is negotiated in a way that people don't say yes because they want the payment or they want a meal for the day. You know, maybe in some places food is really scarce. They're in high levels of economic precarity, or they want access to some kind of consumer good. Often where I work, for example, in PNG, I'll give just a small amount of money so people can purchase phone credits. I have to be really careful that it's never too, like so much that it's often not, very tokenistic for me, 1 or 2 kina, like maybe, a couple of Australian dollars. But if it's more than that, we have to be really careful because everyone then is queuing up to do the research, not because they want to participate necessarily, but they want access to the money. So we need to think about how we're going to negotiate that. As I said, on the other side, there might be also, if we're not careful about our power relationships or how we're negotiating power relationships, people may say yes to participation in research because they're too scared to say no. And that could also be, a particular dynamic if we're working through a gatekeeper sort of situation. And I've just got a couple more points. I think I've already said this about the challenges of working with gatekeepers and how they might try and steer the research process. So often we need to probably triangulate what we're doing with gatekeepers with some other ways of engaging and finding out what people think, and there is a number of different strategies that we could develop to open up the research process a little bit more than, maybe something like an interview, particularly if a gatekeeper says, can I sit in on the interviews, which is quite common actually. That is that's a really challenging situation. And often we're going to need to say, no, you please assist us with setting up the interviews, but we want to make the process as open as possible. The other important thing to talk about here is exposing people to harm as part of the research process. So often when we're filling out the research ethics process, or, if you don't necessarily have a process, you still need to think about this as someone engaging in research is, am I exposing those who I ask to participate in research to harm? Maybe because of retaliation from figures of authority in a community if they find out if a person has participated in your research. If anyone is collaborating with you, we need to think about that as well. Are we potentially putting collaborators in harm's way with our project design and the way we're conducting our research? And also, maybe are we putting ourselves in danger as research leaders? So there's 3 sort of dimensions to it. It's the participants, it's any collaborators, and also ourselves personally. Are we potentially creating harms with the types of work we're doing? So what might those harms be for a participant? As I said, it might be backlash from figures of authority. You will remember when I I talked about my research design for my project on gender violence. That was a big concern for us, was the idea that if we went into communities and said, oh, we want to ask questions about how women think about gender violence and how they manage experiences of gender violence in the community. You can imagine it may not only be the head of a village, for example, which is usually a senior male figure. He may be quite unhappy about people participating in that research. But even if he says yes, maybe the husbands, the brothers, the fathers of women who participate in that research will also be very upset if they think they're going to be discussed negatively by the women who participate. So we were very careful, as you remember, to create a much more abstract sort of set of questions where we only ever talked about safety, we never talked about gender violence, and we never talked about security. We really only talked about women's safety in the community to everyone. And so when women went home, they could say, oh, I participated in a study about women's safety. We never used any reference to gender violence. That's not to say that when women looked at the photos, they didn't talk about gender violence. They knew very well what the study was about, but we gave them language so that they would be safe when they went home. Other things you can do, for example, if you are working on quite a sensitive question, such as gender violence or traumatic experiences, a lot of you are talking about the emotion and trauma that is being felt by people in Cambodia at the moment. If you were to do research on that, for example, it is highly likely that people will become distressed. If you're talking about emotion and trauma, other people are going to be thinking about that and maybe thinking about it when they answer questions and then become visibly upset and traumatized. So we need to make sure that we account for that possibility. And maybe even if it feels quite remote, even if you're interviewing public figures, we're often asked as researchers, as part of our ethics protocol process, to say, what will you do if someone becomes distressed in answering your questions? So often the things that you might say are, we will have materials available to ensure that anyone who becomes distressed knows who they might contact to receive some kind of support, whether that be a counseling organization, an NGO that addresses some kind of issue, like if it's gender violence, for example, that can provide support to women, whether that be counseling support or maybe they want some other, so we could say psychosocial support or some referral advice as well if they want to take the complaint further. So being prepared and not being taken off guard. But the second thing to say is not you yourself as a researcher trying to resolve the situation, because we're often not trained to do that, but being able to guide someone to professionals who can help anyone who becomes distressed as part of the research process. So it's important to anticipate that this might happen, not to be taken by surprise if it does happen. Because if you're taken by surprise, you're not prepared and you don't know what to do. It's important to think about this before you design your research. That is called an ethical research design, right? Or before you undertake your research, rather. Another way, the other thing to say with trauma, participant trauma, is the other thing we can do is write into our research protocols that if someone becomes distressed, we offer to terminate the interview, right? Without them being prejudiced in any way. And what I mean by without being prejudiced is that we don't then reflect badly on what the participant does at that point, but we treat them fairly. It is their right to remove themselves from the interview process if the discussion becomes too painful. So that's a very important protocol. I'm going to explain a little bit how that works in terms of the formal consent process in a minute. As I said, working with local experts and community practitioners so that you are receiving the right advice from people before you conduct your participant research is also really important. So discuss with them, what the risks might be and what you could do in terms of referring, who are the right people to refer to, etc. And then we also need to think about how will we manage our own safety and those who maybe collaborate with us in research in terms of how we're framing the work that we do. So returning back to that idea of, talking about safety rather than violence, rather than trauma, maybe, we could talk about self-care rather than trauma, potentially. How do we create some language around what we're hoping to study in a way that does not create suspicion from others or, a hostility to the research project. So all of this, when we're thinking about these kinds of things, leads into a discussion about how to manage consent in the research process. So ethical research, as I said earlier, part of the negotiation with participants is that they need to feel that they have autonomy in how they manage their interactions with you as the research lead and potentially the person wanting to find out information from them. So what we are aiming to do with an ethical consent process, so we call this process of managing the terms of the engagement between the researcher and the research participant, the consent process. And we want to make sure there's autonomy in this research process and that participants are informed about what the terms of their participation, right? So they don't feel coerced and they feel that they have a degree of ability to manage how the interview proceeds. So to do this, we use what we call an informed consent process. So that requires us to explain very clearly to participants both what the research is about, so they understand the purpose. We need to explain to them clearly the advantages and disadvantages of participation so that we make participants aware of the potential risks of participation and we avoid giving them false hopes. And this is really important when working with vulnerable communities because sometimes people might listen to you talking about your research and think, oh, wow, something's really going to change in this community, right? If I give my information to this person, my circumstances are going to be better. And, we really need to be clear with participants that we're collecting information and, we're going to try and do whatever it is that we do with that information, but we're probably not going to be able to change their world and we're not going to be able to change it overnight, right? So we need to be very clear about what the limits of the research is, what the limits of the research are, and what the timeframes are, and also how we will share the results of the research with the participants. That's often a question that people ask, and maybe you've already encountered that as researchers. People are like, well, what's going to be in it for me? What do I get out of this? And I have to sometimes be really clear and say, look, I will share the results. I will try and disseminate the results, but I can't tell you personally that there is going to be an advantage. But I hope your story, along with many others, will create some kind of impetus for change. But that's about, sadly, the best that I can do sometimes. I would love to be able to be more concrete with my participants. But, I think it's much better to be honest, because if we're not, and we oversell the results, that makes it so much harder to go back into those communities or for other researchers who follow in your footsteps to go back into those communities too. And that, it creates a situation where sometimes people say, I don't want to participate in research. I'm sick of researchers. I've encountered that perception a lot in my own work. We also need to explain to participants, as I said, that they have control over their participation and that they can ask for things to be removed from the record of their participation. So often you say to research participants, if you want to get back in touch with me and withdraw a response, that's absolutely fine. If you want to make what we call off the record comments, which means they can tell you something, but you don't record that and you don't use it in your research. It may still influence how you think about the research, but a quote cannot be directly attributed to that person, or even if they ask for anonymity, that research site or whatever. I just talked then about anonymity. That is another thing that is very important when we're setting up the terms of consent. Do participants want to be named and identifiable, or do they want to participate in the study, but they want to be anonymous? I'm often surprised how many women say to me, no, I want my name. I want my name to be known. And I often have to sometimes still ensure that they're anonymous, because I feel sometimes they may not be aware of the danger they're putting themselves in. So I often, sometimes if it's a very, well-respected leader who I know understands the risks of having her name attached to something she said, of course I would leave that. I would leave her to be identifiable in the research. But often I'm worried that women don't understand the risks of what they might be exposed to. And so I often do with my own work. I often think very carefully before I attach someone's name, or even a research site. We can talk more about this in the Q&A, because sometimes it's actually, even if we de-identify our data, it's sometimes quite easy, if people know, it would be quite a particular setting to identify who a participant is. And then at the end, when we've discussed all of this, we note the terms, we record the terms of the participation. So often what we do here at UQ is we prepare a written consent form, which clearly, and a project description, which the participant keeps if they want, and a consent form where we run through the terms of the participation. We tick certain boxes, we leave other boxes unticked, and then the participant signs it. We can also do that verbally if people are uncomfortable with, or don't have high literacy levels. But it's a very important process to take part, to ensure that our research is ethical. So this is what a consent form looks like. I might just upload some of these so Moani can share, like some examples of these. I think both DB and I will have them for various projects that we've done. But we have, first of all, the project description form, which, as I said, explains the project and what we want to know from participants, what kind of commitment we're looking from, how long might an interview take? Is it just a questionnaire? As I said, likely risks to the participants, and then the terms of their anonymity, and all the other rights that they have, in terms of they can withdraw without penalty, they won't be discriminated against if they withdraw from the study. We won't represent them in a pejorative way, in a negative way, that they have the right to make off-the-record comments, and they have the right to contact us again to ask for a revision of something they've said. If a hard copy as part of your ethics design and your research design is required, then we need to think also, how do we store these forms so that if we're working in a sensitive context, they won't be found by someone else or accessed by someone without authority, and that participation is shared. And as I said, we can also go through this process and do a verbal consent as well with groups that maybe don't have high levels of literacy. I'm going to just skip through that slide because that pretty much says what I already said. I've also said all of that, so I'll skip through that one. Isn't that good? I'm getting through these slides quicker than I anticipated. Storage of data. This is another really important aspect of ethical research design. So once we've negotiated all our protocols with the community, with the participants, we've gone through the gatekeeper process. We feel like we've got a good sample of participants. We've conducted our interviews, and we're happy with the data. Then we need to say, okay, what are we going to do with this data? Because particularly if we're working in sensitive contexts, and particularly where lots of people ask for anonymity, we need to make sure that no one can get hold of this data, right? It may be very precious. And it may be crucial to ensuring the security of our participants. So your research data should always be stored on password protected devices. That means if you're taking notes on a notepad or on your laptop, or you're recording data on your laptop or on a voice recorder, that anyone who finds that device, or if it gets stolen, cannot access that data, right? This is very important. If you're taking written notes, which we often do, also, what are you going to do? How are you going to make sure that no one, if they found that notebook, if you lost it or it got stolen, would understand what's going on with that research, okay? So you need to, and cannot identify the participants. So you need to think carefully about how will you protect that data so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. This is particularly important if we're working in sensitive contexts, or where participants have specifically requested that they can't be identified. If that is the case, that they say that, then we also need to, as soon as we can, de-identify our data so it can't be traced back to participants. So that means you will know, potentially, but it also means that you assign some kind of pseudonym or code to the participant. That might also mean in some cases that you need to assign a code to the place of participation. Say if you're working in a very small village, this is really pertinent to the types of places I work in. And even if I de-identify and have a pseudonym, it might be quite easy for people to work out who is answering research questions simply because of the way they answer or other data that might be recorded. Because we might record, age, number of dependents, information that reveals class identity or ethnicity. So we need to think carefully about what de-identification means. And I actually read a piece of research about research ethics recently, and it actually said that if you think about it, it is actually really, really, really hard to fully de-identify our research data. So we need to think very carefully about this. That might make you worry because you might think, well, then I can't differentiate between different responses, and that's going to compromise my analysis. I would argue it's still possible, right? But you just need to work at a higher conceptual level. So you might not say, 10 women in this village said something and 15 women in this village said something, in the same village said something else. What you might do is say women in remote villages are more likely to respond in this way. Women in urban settings are more likely to respond in this way. So we're working perhaps at a higher conceptual level. Or we might use broad age bands. Like we might say women between 23 and 35 as compared to young women, as compared to, older women, maybe women in their 50s, 50 to 60, for example. Just to say a little bit more about, inclusive research, because this is the way this research training is designed. I think there are feminist principles of ethics research that can be translated in ways that are broadly relevant to the goal of developing inclusive research. So if we're talking about inclusive research, that means we don't just access those it's easy to access in research, but we think about building out the lessons we can learn from our research by interviewing people of diverse ethnicities, diverse class backgrounds, diverse faith backgrounds, people with disabilities, elderly people, young people, the diverse representation of our communities, and not just interviewing those in maybe a church group that we're part of, a faith-based group that we're part of, or a cultural group or a sporting group, because they're easy for us to access, right? So in line with ethical protocols, again, we need to think about power. If we're going into those diverse communities that we don't know, how do we negotiate the terms of consent? And how do we ensure that people are not participating because either they've been told to by someone else, or because they feel lesser than us and they're like, oh, it's what I should do. You know, maybe out of politeness, maybe out of a sense of accommodating a stranger, or maybe just because they're too embarrassed, or they just feel like the power differential is such that they should go along with the, you know, the research, the request for participation, or because we're paying them, right? So we need to think about those power dynamics quite clearly. But then we also need to think about what we do with the results, right? Because we sometimes, when we're working in a community that is different to our own, we might apply our ideas about what is normal when we're analyzing the research data, our ideas about what is normal, for example, norms of gender relations in Western countries, and we go somewhere else to a different society and say, well, why doesn't it look like what's going on in my community? Something's wrong with these people, right? And we call that process an orientalizing process, hugely critiqued in post-colonial literature, right? And post-colonial studies of, for example, anthropological studies, this idea that, we're measuring the ways in which community relations are negotiated according to European norms, and so forth. So that's been hugely criticized for, at least 3 decades. However, we can also fall into that trap even when we're working in our own country, but with groups that potentially don't look exactly like our own community, right? So it's important to think about the ways in which we assess the findings from our research participation, so that we don't apply judgments that are unfair and that don't reflect the ways in which community life might be negotiated in places that are different to our own. Another thing that we might do to sort of challenge some of these power differentials is to think about, well, what is the research design, and how can we include maybe some of the people we want to participate in the research in the design of our research, so that they feel more able to participate, that we don't go in with a pre-designed project and say, oh, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to do it, and these are the findings I would like to gather. Rather, we say, well, I've got this idea for research. These maybe are my ideas, but what do you think about that? And do you think this is valid? And how could we work together to develop this so that you get something out of it as well? Maybe it meets some objective that you have and the objective I have. So we call that like a participatory research process, or an active research design process, where we involve the participants in the participation in the project design, so that they have a stronger stake in what the outcomes of the research are. That's quite a valuable approach, which means that some of those hesitations and some of that maybe potential hostility that people might feel about research is greatly minimized. It doesn't mean that just because people then sign up to the project in 3 months, they're still hugely interested in it. We know that, interest can wane, but, I think it is quite an ethical way to think about how we can develop a project in collaboration with stakeholders in the community if we're interested in inclusive research design. And then we might think about research that, what is the normative goal of our research, particularly if we're doing inclusive research? What is it? What kind of broad objectives are we trying to achieve with our research? Is it making voices that are marginalized maybe better heard and better understood? Is it trying to maybe shed light on an issue that is not well understood at higher levels. It might be very well understood in a particular community, but it's not understood at higher levels of policy making and decision making, that kind of thing. Okay. So just to conclude, why is all of this important? It's important because we want to do research. Ethical research is about respecting the rights of participants. It protects the welfare of participants. It protects the safety of researchers, both your collaborators and you yourselves. It avoids reproducing discrimination and disempowerment. And particularly if we're working with vulnerable communities who already experience a lot of that, we don't want to replicate those models, right? We don't want to use our own power to contribute to further discrimination when we're trying to work in communities where people are living in, with a lot of vulnerability. It also ensures our research is robust. And so I've got there and to make sure that it's not hijacked by those with power. So for example, the authority of the gatekeeper. How do we manage, how do we recognize, how do we anticipate, how do we recognize, and then how do we navigate the power and authority of gatekeepers to ensure that we're not producing research that the gatekeeper wants to see, right? That we're producing robust research, that we minimize disruption to people's lives. If we're going to do interviews, don't make them 2 hours long unless they seem to really be wanting to enjoy the process. Sometimes I've had research interviews that go on for 2.5 hours and I feel really reluctant to interrupt people. But if they're going to give me their time, then I'm like, please go ahead. Just if this is important to you, you have something you want to share with me. So that we need to manage those dynamics and read how people are, the terms of their participation and what they're getting out of it. And that we don't produce false hopes with the work that we do, and that we're realistic. We're realistic in terms of explaining clearly to people what the research is about and what it will hopefully achieve, but not sort of encouraging people to think that they've given you a 1-hour interview and that's going to create some massive change in their life. Because, very often these things are really, we don't have that power as researchers. We do have the power, of course, to share their stories, which is, I think, important too. Now, I'm going to stop, and I'm sure my colleagues, DB and Kirill, might have other things that they want to add, but I'm going to stop talking now.
We got a few questions here, if you would like to respond first or later.
Yeah, sure. Let me stop sharing.
Yeah.
Or maybe we can open it up for discussion because DB and Kirill and everyone is researchers, it's not just me. So
Well, can I just, sorry, Mohani, I was just going to ask a very basic question out of curiosity, Nicole. When you're talking about data storage, how long do you have to keep that data for? Do you know? Is there a minimum requirement based on law or legislation? Where does that come from? Do you know?
DB, sorry, Kirill, I think that would be very much dependent on each country, but I don't actually know. But I keep all my data because as part of my research consent form, actually, this is an important issue that I didn't raise, and it's one that's actually come up for one of my PhD students. I often write into the consent form that I would like to use the data for future research as well. So not for just the specific project, but to be able to draw on it maybe for other research projects further down the track. So I always write that into my ethics protocol. So that means it might surprise you, but I have interview data still from my PhD that I keep.
Yeah.
That was 20 years ago. That was 20 years ago, which makes me feel so old.
That's really good. I wasn't sure if there was a minimum amount of time you had to keep it for or not before it could, end up getting to the incinerator.
I mean, can I just jump in? Yeah. Look, I think, Carol, I don't know exact number of years, but I think there's certain expectations from, especially in the university setting, because I'm saying this because I remember I did one, along complex ethics applications recently. I can't remember the exact number of years that we were required to have this data, stored for. But for my recent postdoctoral project, which was like a couple of years before that, I think the minimum requirement in that university was 5 years. So that's I still remember. So I think there's a bit of expectations here that it is stored for a considerable period of time. And as Nicole said, if you have a plan to reuse this data in future, universities now, moving towards storing data in online platforms, I think it can even be longer than 5 years, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, that's another thing to say. Increasingly, we're being asked also to make our data sources open. So, de-identification is really important in those settings. I've resisted with the research that I presented on that photo elicitation project. I'm very reluctant to make that an open data source because I feel like even with as much de-identification as possible, I'm worried that people could be identifiable. So because these are small island states,
Kim-san, are you aware of any, data storage and ethics related legislations, law requirements in the Cambodian context?
To my knowledge, no.
Okay.
To my knowledge, okay. And I am also from a legal background, from like law school. So in law school, we don't do much data collections. So I think from other university, maybe if any of our participants that come from Cambodian University that has ethical research committee, please share. But to my knowledge and my experience with other university that I have been working with them, no, because we don't have the resource to run it, and also the expertise to do it, and we focus more on the teaching than doing research. So a lot of research has been done outside university settings through a lot of projects, but at the university level, we don't even have. At least at the university where I come from in Cambodia, we don't have many research projects at all. So when I used to talk with the management, they say that they don't need it because they don't even have research project, to conduct.
Yeah. I think there's a comment from Mono who just noted, I think in area of public health and medical research, there's a strict requirement, in Cambodia, but it seems like the enforcement mechanisms outside of these fields are not very robust, or even probably not much requirement. But I think, in my view, even if your country or institutions do not have strict ethics related requirements and policies, if you are going to publish your research outputs in good quality journals, then the journals in particular country or international, the committee of journals has very strict requirements and clear expectations, right? So that's why even if there are no local requirement, I think our advice is that is still follow certain procedures and protocols of maintaining ethics standard for your research, because that's so important for publication, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think what we might do, DB, is actually bring the sample. When we come over, we'll bring this or share with you the online UQ ethics procedure, like the questions that are asked. I think you will be shocked when you see how much work is required by us to get ethics approval. Even for a small consultancy project, it's probably 2 days work. It's very interesting. Like we follow what we call the NHMRC here, National. I can't remember, but anyway, I can't remember what the full acronym, and maybe actually that's the health one. Is it the health one?
Yeah, and NHMRC is
human research ethics protocols. Anyway, it's a national set of guidelines, and UQ's developed a process, but it is
Very
an
robust.
intensive process. And if you have anything that's even remotely complex, it's quite an arduous thing to do.
Yeah.
I can see some good questions here. Mwani, shall we just go through those? Because I want to make sure we have enough time for DB and Kirill, but I feel like these questions are quite important.
They are, of course. Yes, Nicole. Let's talk
That's
about
two comments about, asking for references. Like, so that's good that you already addressed that you will show them like a consent form. So that's one of the participants is asking, like, can I see an example? And the other participant asks about trauma-informed research method, like how many, what are available materials there for that process? And the discussion white, one question from Ching is that to what extent potential basis on ethical challenges when there is a researcher possess credible institutional backing and whole nationality privileges related to specific political dynamic. So I think it is something like a foreigner researcher. If it is not comprehensive, like Ching, can you please come in and ask a question on that?
Yes, thank you. I recently I came across lots of articles or opinion piece published on what I would say credible international media platforms about what is happening between Thailand and Cambodia. And a few happen to be like the author of the opinion piece or the articles is they hold Thai nationality, and if at least to my very limited knowledge in research, I can see like lack of kind of fact checking, or at least having kind of quote voice from another country, from Cambodia, for example, rather than just like telling all figures and idea about Thailand. And since now we are talking about inclusive research and ethical, I'm wondering if Nicole or Keria or Debbie, if you came across any discussion or experience in how, with potential bias or ethical challenge that can happen in such opinion piece research or article when the author or co-author has institutional backing and they have the privilege of being a Thai national, for example. I'm going very specific. Yeah, and in that case, what can we do as researcher or as institution to avoid such bias or challenges? Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much. This is a great question. I guess in some ways, I hate to say this, but I think in some ways you answered your question a little bit there in posing it. And these are the dangers of what we call academic opinion pieces, right? So they're academic opinion pieces written by researchers about a particular situation, and they're writing and drawing on their research, but it's also research. It's a piece framed by their opinion. So we need to ask ourselves, okay, who and what is this piece of writing for, right? And what audience is it for? And who is the person writing this piece? I think, would this piece, clearly you have some, I don't know which piece it is, but whatever it is that you've been reading, would it actually be published in a peer-reviewed journal? If it is relying heavily on opinion and it's not being backed up and substantiated in a robust way, and in a way that attempts to provide more what am I trying to say? A, fact checking, or B, the counterfactuals, the other perspective, then perhaps the alternative perspective, maybe is a better way of putting it, then perhaps it's not going to get through the academic peer review process. It doesn't mean that pieces like this don't produce a lot of harm. I can understand why you find it very upsetting. But I think what is going on there is it's an opinion piece, probably published in a particular website, and maybe from quite a nationalist, Thai nationalist perspective. I don't know which piece it is, so I don't want to get into conflict with anyone here. But what I'm saying is, it's sort of, who is it written for, and what is the purpose of the piece? I mean, sometimes I have written pieces like this, also, taking a particular side of an issue because I feel strongly about the issue, and but I still think, even if you're going to write a piece like that, you do need to engage with in a balanced way, and in a way that actually uses data to back up your claims, right? We're always going to, as part of the academic debate, we're always going to have differing opinions. But I guess where the issue comes in is credibility and robustness of the argument. And unfortunately, in those 800 to 900 online pieces, they actually want people to look at them. So it's a bit like academic clickbait. I hope that makes sense if I use that term, like it's designed, sometimes authors want to get as many people reading them as possible. So they can be a little bit playing hard and fast with the facts a little bit to draw eyes to the page.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ching, you still have a follow-up question? See the hand raise.
Yes, it's not a follow-up question, but I am just like to add. So I'm not exactly sure how a research or media kind of really works when before they publish a piece of article or analysis or whatever. But I assume as international media or institutions, before they publish something, at least there should be a committee or a working group that review article. I'm not exactly sure because it seems that the writer or the author of such article is from that particular institution or media. So I have always believed that credible institution or international media kind of bring balanced view to the international community. So we can see a piece of article or information provide a balanced view or not by provide some kind of figures for that very particular issue, especially also when the issue is very sensitive, by having even the balance of analysis and figures in a way that's showing this country or that country, not just like one-sided. So
Look, just in the interest of time, sorry. In the interest of time, I think it's an important point, and I don't mean to cut you off. It's a very important point, but I think the thing is, we know that unfortunately in those type of forums, balance is part of the equation, but it's not always the most important part, right? And I think often these things are written to challenge discussion as well. And that doesn't stop someone from a Cambodian research institution writing their perspective, right? That's the other thing. If there's an alternative perspective, someone else can write it. So I think I understand it's obviously something that's very upsetting, but how can I put this? We're in the marketplace of ideas, unfortunately, and media organizations and universities want to have sort of impact in this marketplace of ideas sometimes, and that's how some people go about it. So I guess the answer is, what can you do is counter it by producing another piece to address some of the inaccuracies. That's the job of someone that's a way of responding. Anyway, I'm sorry to cut you off, but there are other questions, and I'm just aware that we're already at 2:10, so we've only got a little bit of time left. I'll just address the question on trauma. because I think that's an important one, trauma-informed research. And yes, we don't want to, what's the word I'm trying to use here? We don't want to make the trauma that people feel, make it worse by what we're doing and asking about the things that cause them trauma. For my own work, this has been hugely important. What I will do when I come to Cambodia, or maybe we'll put together a little portfolio of materials. I've got some really nice materials from peace and conflict studies and also from gender studies that are not just pertinent to those fields, that are pertinent to many fields. You know, you could think about medical research and people talking about illnesses that they've been through, or research on grief, or research on memory. You know, it goes way beyond. It goes way beyond just peace and conflict studies and gender and those kinds of things. So thank you. We'll put together a little group of materials so you can have a look. I mean, I think one of the things to say is creative research design sometimes can help us deal with some of those things. So I encourage you to think both creatively as much as you can, and the ways in which people might be able to reflect on traumatic things, but in ways that also allow them to produce something, or you to produce something as the researcher in terms of innovative research methods. Was there any other important
Sorry,
question?
there's still 4 more questions additional. So it's really running out of time, but I'll just quickly read through so that you can compile and answer quickly, Nicole.
I might think about the questions while Kirill and DB are doing their presentation. So let's just quickly run through them, yeah?
Yeah, okay, that's question on the gatekeeper role, because they are selecting the participant, especially the project is trying to analyze the impact of what they are doing, but the gatekeeper already choose the participant. So as a research consultant, like how should they tackle that situation? And then the other 3 questions, to what extent research ethics differ based on methodological design? Is it quantitative, qualitative methods of a study? And then the other one is on, should a legal research have different approach, or does it have the same approach on the ethical rules? And the last one, could you share any real example of research article submitted for a journal that was rejected due to ethical flaws? Like, are there any lessons we should learn from there? Yeah.
Oh, great question.
Moani, just in response to Mono's last question there, if you want, I can bring those, I can redact all names and make them anonymized, but I can bring those that have been rejected from the journal that I work for that are on genocide research that are actually on Cambodia. So if they're interested to know what gets rejected on Cambodians past, I can bring some of those examples along if you're interested.
But is it on ethical grounds, Kirill, or more just research generally?
I'll go back and look. I think,
generally.
Yeah, more generally, probably the research. I'll go back. There's lots of them. So let me go and look and see if there's any have been rejected on ethical grounds. Of late, there have been on Gaza and Palestine, but I don't know whether we want to delve into that topic. But there have been a couple on ethical grounds on that. So I could definitely bring examples of those along.
A quick comment on the rejection issue. In my experience, a lot of time, if there are any pertinent ethical issues or ethical concern from journal's editorial board, I think that sort of concerns is often reflected in the questions or comments around your methodology, because ethical issues are often related to methodological clarity and transparency in your article. So you may not receive a very a totally separate comment on ethics, but it can be part of a comment on methodology.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe I'll go quiet now and I'll think about some answers to some of these questions, and DB and Kirill can take the floor from here. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
Yeah. DB, just in response to that, I know you're going to talk on AI. I'm happy at the end of this, we could either do a broader exercise as a participatory exercise on some cultural specificities, but then we can also maybe take that to next week as well and start next week on a different approach to it, or we can manage something like that. So don't feel rushed.
Or we could do it for the in-person training, it might be fun to do an exercise in the in-person training.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm not. Yeah. So don't feel rushed, Devi. That's the only thing.
Sure. I mean, I think we have about 44 minutes. So I'm hoping to use about 25 minutes. I have a couple of slides and then see how we go from there. Maybe people have some questions at the end of my presentations. All right. So is this okay if I go first, Kirill? Yeah. All right. Sure. Let me just share my slides. Okay. Thank you, Nicole, for your very elaborate, very in-depth discussion about ethics. So what I'm going to do in another 25 minutes is also talk about ethical issues, but like Nicole's presentations was mostly around ethical issues that we confront in the field work when we engage with other human subjects, like, our research subjects, but human being in the field, our interactions with other people. But what I'm going to do today is to talk about some ethical issues that we observe, we encounter when we engage with non-human elements, so to speak, in terms of research. And this is what I'm referring to artificial intelligence, what is known as in our times. So artificial intelligence actually is a terminology that is assigned, and you probably, everyone's maybe familiar with that, is assigned with tools and technologies and elements that we use to produce or to engage with our writing. And to some extent, this is not entirely a new thing, because, for example, in the past, we've been using artificial intelligence of one kind or another, maybe a lesser developed form of artificial intelligence to, with our research, with our writing. For example, Grammarly has been around for a long time, and universities were even allowing people to use Grammarly to check grammars and language and punctuations and etc. But the real challenges with artificial intelligence in relation to research and writing actually started back around in 2020, around 2022, when ChatGPT actually introduced released its new version that was available to people to use. I think that was in 2022. And since then, artificial intelligence has become a new regime, a new area where there are basically two types of arguments we can see in relation to artificial intelligence and research and writing. One is that artificial intelligence, we have to totally, avoid using artificial intelligence because it is destructive. It does more harm to human rationality and critical thinking than any good. And then the other argument is that it is the reality of the day and we cannot really live without it. So we have to learn how to live with it and how to use it responsibly. And I think this is where artificial intelligence has increasingly become a subject of research ethics, but also research integrity, and in university settings, serious topics for academic integrity and academic conduct or misconduct. I must admit the fact that I'm myself learning this thing because, in our universities, we are being provided some trainings to how to responsibly use and take advantage of these new technologies for teaching and learning purposes. And for that matter, I'm also reading a couple of literatures around here, and my presentations today is based on my personal reflections and some of the readings that I have done recently on this topic, right? To move forward, I want to ask people a very quick questions to see what's your understanding about artificial intelligence and writing. So the question here is, can you please just type on the chat box, how confident are you in using artificial intelligence for research and writing? So in your response, number one would be the the lowest number. If you are not confident or if you haven't used it, then maybe you go for the lowest rank, but 10 being the maximum ranking. Let's see what people are doing, how people are experiencing these things, whether that's in terms of your research or any other kinds of writing. Okay, yeah. Good, interesting. Right, let's take a couple of more. It's sort of a fun exercise, isn't it? 6, 5, 3, 1. Okay. All right, thank you. So it looks like some of you have considerable experience with AI. Some of you are not experts, but that's fine. And my objective here is not to help you how to what exactly we can do to in terms of using artificial intelligence in research. But what I try to do is just to talk a little bit about ethical and integrity issues that are related with the use of AI. Okay. So to do that, let's have a look at what AI can or cannot do for the research purpose, where we were and where we are heading to, in other words, right? So in the past, there were different forms of artificial intelligence tools that were available. And one example I was giving was Grammarly before. And in the past, we have been used to, even like Microsoft Word has a autocorrect function, spelling checkers, and other kinds of grammar and paraphrasing and writing functions available. So we've been actually using artificial intelligence in the past for grammar corrections, and to some extent, paraphrasing some words here and there for better clarity and flow. Things like, for example, tools like Grammarly does that pretty well. But the major concerns that actually we have seen in the academic institutions like university and other settings, and with the journals and publication process, is that this relates to this idea of AI assisted or AI generative writing. So what does that mean is now the recent artificial intelligence tools like ChatGPT, I think DeepSeek could be another one, and there are a few others actually, which can in fact produce a whole lot of text, even paragraphs, or even like in some cases like entire articles that can be produced by the use of these artificial intelligence tools. So it can also generate new ideas and concepts, but the question is, how ethical is that? To what extent we can really go about using artificial intelligence in research, especially when it comes to ethical research and something that we want to do with maintaining, upholding research integrity. A few words about why AI-assisted writing is a concern, why it matters for ethical and integrity points of view. Basically, there are four broader sort of, concepts or ideas in relation to this question. And the first one actually relates to our intellectual contributions when we are engaged in research and writing. Because doing research and writing is not just about producing a research output, right? This is also being fair and transparently engaging with the research process. For example, developing concepts, developing methodology, doing field work, interpreting data, and in doing that, you are expected to demonstrate your academic competency, because by doing research, you are making intellectual contributions, but you are also enhancing your academic competency. So the questions with AI-assisted writing or AI generative writing is that how much intellectual contributions one can make, or how much, to what extent, academic competency you can demonstrate with the help of with the use of AI in writing. And the more importantly, I suppose, the question is, where can we draw the line? Okay, and the other two set of questions are about the process. The process, I mean, one of the issues that relates to process is how accurate the content is that you would produce with the help of AI, and to what extent the author of the content who has used AI can be accountable to what has been produced. Who is accountable, after all, to the text or content that's generated by the help of AI? And for that matter, it's also concerns with the question of transparency and the process of ethical engagement with the new knowledge. Earlier, Nicole talked a lot, like the question of power, for example, anonymity, risks, social harm, etc., etc. So some of these issues may still be relevant to the way we use artificial intelligence in research. For example, how we can going to think of power. And power is also very significant because artificial intelligence can actually produce research that is substandard, that is biased, and that can actually impact on the power relationship in the community. The example of the kind of academic opinion piece that we were talking earlier, if that kind of piece is actually produced by the use of artificial intelligence, you can think of how that affects people, how that affects the power relations, even social relationship between people who are living in, who are divided in a society, possibly living in two different countries, having two different nationalities. So how is AI is going to influence, for example, the power relations to the people who consume the outputs produced by the use of AI. So these are like four major sort of issues that we often come across when it comes to producing content with the help of artificial intelligence. So what are the specific ethical considerations or ethical issues that we come across? One of the major ethical considerations is plagiarism, what we call it. Plagiarism is, generally speaking, a kind of using someone's work without giving proper acknowledgement or proper citations, and using or claiming someone's work as being your own. This is a classical, this is old plagiarism, in the academic context. But with regard to the use of artificial intelligence, there is also new sort of, plagiarism issues that has come to the forefront, what we also call like plagiarism 2.0, if you like, which means, in the old context, people would copy someone's text from internet or from other sources, verbatim, put in your writing without any due references or citations, and claim that being the author's original work. That's an old plagiarism. But in case of new plagiarism with in relation to the use of artificial intelligence, the text is not someone's work copied from internet or somewhere else. This is a text actually generated by the help of artificial intelligence, which the author in that case might claim the content being their own. I have actually one example just to give you sort of an idea of how does this new plagiarism issues that has been very common with the use of AI. And you can see on this slide here. Let me read this out for everyone. Okay, so this is a scenario here. There's a researcher is preparing a literature review, possibly as part of an essay or maybe for a research project, and used artificial intelligence tool to generate summaries of recent studies on inclusive public policy in relation to disability and social security. Okay, so this is the context. So the summary has been produced with the help of AI, but the researcher hasn't read or reviewed the original papers. And the researchers actually copied several of AI-generated summaries directly into their draft, which included generalizations and factual errors as well, such as, overstating the effectiveness of certain policies. Okay, and in the paper or in the research report or research outputs, there is no disclosure of AI assistance that was used to write this literature review. And then the researchers submitted the paper as entirely their own work. So this kind of scenario is becoming increasingly common because artificial intelligence can produce things which looks like as if written by human. Okay, and we often see this as a case even in academic institutions and in other settings as well. This is not someone's work. This is not something that is really published earlier. This is entirely generated by the help of artificial intelligence. So where is the problem? Why is it problematic from ethical point of view? It is problematic because there is no reference to the way artificial intelligence has been used to generate this text. The author has claimed AI generated text as their own, which is not true, which is not ethical way of writing a paper. So let's look at another example where the same exercise might look a little bit different, but maybe acceptable for some journals. Okay, for example, in the example 2, as you can see, the same researcher is working on literature review. They used AI tool to help draft preliminary summary of recent studies on inclusive public policy and on disability and social security. So rather than copying the output directly, the researcher used it as a starting point for their writing, for the literature review, and carefully cross-checked each summary with the original paper. Means they really visited the papers that were summarized in the literature review. The researcher then rewrote them in their own words. So it's only used that as a reference reference text and rewrote the entire thing in their own word, checked and attributed proper citations. So in the methodology sections of the review paper, the researchers also clearly included a statement in terms of how artificial intelligence was used. For example, this is just an example of the statement that you might like to consider including in your own work, for example. But this is just one example, and it can be something slightly different depending on what kind of pieces that you are working on. Okay, for example, the statement here is preliminary summaries were generated with the assistance of an AI tool, ChatGPT, more specific, and all content was subsequently verified, revised, and authored by the researcher. So this kind of acknowledgement, this kind of disclosure statements gives validity and helps making this writing more ethical. It gives more clarity. So with artificial intelligence, the point to keep in mind here is that plagiarism is an issue, but it's slightly different than the old style of plagiarism. The other ethical considerations is what is called fake and hallucinated references. And what I'm going to actually show you is very interesting because I asked ChatGPT to produce a short description about community reconciliation in Sri Lanka. This is a country I do my field work, right? And I actually started putting a prompt. And very interestingly, what I find is that the ChatGPT produced a very fascinating text, which is this, okay? Grassroots reconciliation. And this is about grassroots reconciliation, right? So grassroots reconciliation initiatives have played a key role in post-war Sri Lanka, which is 100% true. It has done. There's no doubt about it, particularly in fostering inter-ethnic understanding and cohesion in northern and eastern province, which is, again, it's true. It's not wrong. According to Subedi 2018, and very interestingly, look, the ChatGPT actually referred to my work, 2018. Community-led peace-building efforts have been more sustainable than state-imposed reconciliation framework. Okay, sounds plausible, sounds convincing as of now, largely due to their cultural relevance and participatory structures. I don't know about that. These insights highlight the importance of locally grounded solutions in post-conflict context. And then here is the citation. Subedi DB, Grassroots Peace Building and Reconciliation in Post-War Sri Lanka, Asian Journal of Conflict Resolution. I was really surprised to see this. You know, the fact is that I have researched peace building in Sri Lanka. I have done work on reconciliation. And actually, I did a paper on reconciliation in 2018. But it was published as a book chapter. And I didn't write about grassroots reconciliation. I was mostly talking about the reconciliation and transitional justice institutions and mechanisms, national level architecture, and the government approaches to how it was being done, right? So what's the problem? What is an ethical issue here as a researcher if someone is going to use this? Because it looks really convincing, you know, and if you really talk to someone, people would actually say, might not, even from inside the country, might not disagree with this. The problem here is, although this sounds a convincing argument, first of all, the journal doesn't exist, Asian Journal of Conflict Resolution. It doesn't exist at all. I haven't published a paper on grassroots reconciliation, although I co-authored a paper with my colleague from Sri Lanka on developmental path or developmental approach to reconciliation. But interestingly, it was published in 2018 as a book chapter. So this is clearly an example of fake and hallucinated references and hallucinated text, which generally appears like the real one, can actually make people fool about it, you know. But clearly, from ethical point of view, this is wrong. From factual point of view, this is wrong as well. Okay, so the second ethical consideration is fake and hallucinated references. The third example I'm going to use, I actually extracted it from, you know, one of the examples I was reading about, and this is what is called fabricated informations. AI can produce informations which looks as if real one, but it becomes really fabricated. In some cases, it resembles to the original source of information. It is something sort of, to some extent, similar to fake, fabricated, or hallucinated references. But in this case, I'm going to demonstrate how informations can be manipulated by artificial intelligence, and which is not transparent, which is wrong, which is fake, and which is ethically problematic. So look at here. This is an example about civil society's role on sustainable implementation of sustainable development goal in South Asia. So this is actually a report. I don't want to go in detail, but what it says is that it actually refers to the work of a particular organization, Pratham Global Foundations in India. It actually also, the text also actually refers to certain statistics. Okay, for example, 1.2 million students in remote villages. It drastically improved literacy rate, reached out to 1.2 million students in remote villages of India with the work of these organizations called Pratham Global Foundation. It also actually cites research from publications from UNDP and other organizations in Bangladesh and provides a statistics which looks real, for example, which shows that the local NGOs reduced poverty by 45% in climate affected district through micro loan program. As you know, that Sri Lanka, Bangladesh is a country where the idea of Grameen Bank and microcredit was pioneered. So by looking at this, if we don't go and verify these statistics in sources, in real sources, it appears okay. It appears convincing. And the kind of language, like the first one here in my previous example, it's written in a way that, an academic in peace building would write this kind of stuff. It actually matches the tone, language, and style of writing of an academic in peace and conflict studies. In this case, if you look at the tone, style, and writing, it appears as if it is written by a development practitioners or development scholars, scholars in development studies. Style of writing is mimicked in a way it appears like true. But where are the problems from ethical and integrity, research integrity and ethical point of view? This is the problem, like if you check, Pratham is an NGO, but Pratham Global Foundation, it doesn't exist. And the digital literacy, all campaigns are invented. Both publications cited UNDP and National Alliance for SDG programs are they do not they are not verifiable, and then the report is written as if it is produced by someone working in development studies. So again, unlike the previous one, you can see false references, fake citations. What is also observed here is the fabricated false informations, and this is from ethical point of view, this is definitely unacceptable. This is not good practice, but we happen to see these kind of even the journals articles submitted for journal reviews are increasingly reported to have included these kind of statements. And this is where, Kirill may probably like to talk about this. This is going to be a big issue for journal editors, actually, how to scrutinize this kind of thing. It is not impossible to scrutinize. It is definitely possible, but it really takes a lot of time and energy. Isn't it, Kirill? Yeah. The fourth issue that I wanted to very quickly point to in relation to ethical issues in AI is the question of representation of bias and lack of conflict sensitivity. I don't want to go in detail because I think the example we were talking earlier about the articles we refer to, possibly my guess is that was the article written by some academic or some other people in the context of the escalations between Thai and Cambodian military. I'm just guessing, or maybe something else, whatever. The thing is, the text, generally, the nature of the text that's produced with the help of artificial intelligence it represents biases. It actually has full of biases, and oftentimes it lacks historical context, emotional and contextual sensitivity. So as a result, it actually produces something that, based on how whoever designed these kind of artificial intelligence tools and whatever algorithms they have used, based on that, it can produce something which looks like similar, but it can do more social harm to the readers, to the community, and to the particular type of people. I actually included a abstract and title of this article, which was just published last year. This is about this study actually looks at how artificial intelligence generated text produces informations that is gender bias and bias and discriminates against certain population of certain race. So it also includes racial bias, So of course, avoiding, I mean, one of the things about ethical research is that we want to avoid doing harm to the participants, but also to the wider community when research is produced. But in this case, without proper considerations, if artificial intelligence is used in doing research, then it directly violates the it contradicts or is detrimental to to safety, security, respect, and equity and justice. These are very important issues that we have been discussing. We also discussed this last week, but we also discussed these issues today, right? So this is another thing to look at, how AI producing biased reports, biased content, lacking historical, cultural, emotional, and context-related sensitivities. Now, this is not my work. This is actually, I have actually extracted it from one of the required reading for this week, Cheng et al.'s 2025 publications. So where do we draw the line? If you want to engage, if you want to use artificial intelligence, but at the same time want to do research and writing, upholding ethical standards and academic integrity, where do we draw the line? Actually, in my view, there is no silver bullet to fix this issue, but I actually try to base this this part of my presentations on the paper you are recommended to read. And in that paper, I really like the way the paper actually categorizes the approach into 3 tiers. So the tier 1 is generally the kind of thing we were doing in the past, ethically, and those are considered mostly ethically acceptable. For example, using artificial intelligence for checking grammars and spelling, enhancing readability of your papers or report, and sometimes using language translations, for example. This is the kind of thing we've been doing for a few years already, so there's no issue with that. It's ethically acceptable. The second tier, there's a bit of a gray area here, but it's still ethically contingent and can be acceptable if it is practiced with maintaining transparency and clarity of the process. And the example this includes are generating sort of an outline from the content. You can use AI to generate some outlines. You can possibly use it for summarizing some content, but not the way I showed you earlier, the bad example of doing literature review and using it in your paper without scrutinizing it, for example. Improving clarity of the content and some brainstorming some ideas. And this is not discouraged, this is still to some extent acceptable. But what is really unacceptable, and this is something you should always aim to avoid, is drafting the whole idea from the scratch, developing totally new concepts, because ChatGPT and other kinds of tools are designed in a way, their large language model and algorithms is designed in a way that it can actually read your prompt history. So if you were asking a question in relation to your new questions like 3 days, 4 days, 5 days before, or even in the past, it actually refers that back and then it starts creating something referring to your new prompt and old prompt. And it can be, imagine that you are actually putting, what comes out is, if I have to explain that in a metaphorically, or to give you an analogy, if you are putting like 5 different kinds of food in a blending machine, and if you blend it, imagine what kind of taste it can produce. It can be awful in that sense. So developing new concepts, and even in your research, using AI to interpret your data, those sort of things are unacceptable, and you should be really clear about the ethical boundaries in this case if you are considering to engage or use artificial intelligence for your research. So finally, what's the way forward? Okay, if these are the things, again, there is no shortcut, there is no quick fix, there is no silver bullet, as I said. But again, I actually adapted these 4 sort of considerations from the paper I was referring earlier. I mean, probably the starting point for you, if you want to use artificial intelligence to an acceptable ethical way for your research, is you might ask if you have these 4 questions. Okay, for example, have you used artificial intelligence in ways that ensure your intellectual contribution? Remember, this was one of the issues I raised earlier in my presentation. For example, ideas, insights, analysis, and interpretation. Likewise, have you demonstrated competency through this research, writing analytical? Are you sure about the accuracy of the content? Have you disclosed how AI tools were used in your research? And I think this is very, very important, because nowadays journals actually require people to make this disclosure while submitting their articles to the journal portals. So these are some of the articles I refer to make this presentation. Sorry, I took more than 25 minutes because the topic was such, but I stop here. Thank you, and happy to address if you have any question. I know we only have less than 10 minutes. I hope we can, I don't know.
DB, well, maybe, DB, there is one question there from Meng Li about,
yeah.
It's got there about editing and enhancing written text. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, sorry, what was that?
Oh, Meng Li, are you there?
Oh, hang on. I'm just going to.
Yes, I am.
Sorry?
Yes, I am. I just posted a question earlier. What
It has
about,
become an
like,
integral
you
part of our
already
everyday life.
written your own text, like with your intellectual insight, and somehow you feel like, like most of us like speak English as our second language, so we don't know the extent to which it really capture the whole idea, and oftentimes we tend to throw it into ChatGPT or other Gen AI to just edit and enhance it. And I don't see it as falling into either of your ties that you mentioned earlier.
So you
I
mean
would like
like
to clarify, like, which group does this belong to?
I think if you are actually using ChatGPT or other tools to produce the entire paragraph or even pages, and if that's the kind of text content entirely generated by artificial intelligence, then I think that falls under the 3rd category, tier 3, ethically unacceptable, unless you actually produce those texts. I don't know. I mean, I don't have, what I can say is that if you have checked the factual accuracy, if the idea is clearly yours and you have only used for language enhancement, and I think that's acceptable. Otherwise, if you totally rely on artificial intelligence to produce the whole thing, even paragraph or parts of a paper, then I think that's ethically unacceptable. That's what Nicole and Kirill may have some views on that. Do you have anything to add to that? Yeah, Nicole, please.
Well, Kirill's an editor, so he probably has some things to say. I would just say this from the point of view of a teacher, right, who's interested in pedagogy. I think part of our job as teachers is to encourage students to improve their written English, right? So I'm never upset if I see people who write in a second language and whose grammar and spelling and so forth is not perfect, because I'm happy they're trying. I actually feel really sad when my students, who I know struggle to speak English in class, and I'm talking about students here in Australia, they may struggle to speak English in class, and then they submit me essays that have no grammatical problems. And I'm sort of like, part of my job and part of the reason why you're here, and as Australia Award recipients, I think this might be particularly important, is that actually you have such great language competency, and you learned to have that language competency in an era before AI was really a thing, right? You may have used Grammarly, but really, you know, you didn't have access probably to the tools that students, international students are having today. And so my kind of sadness is, yes, they can use them, but many of them, some don't, some choose not to, because they really want to improve their English. But, you know, I think if you're going back to Cambodia and sort of saying you've got an Australian degree, but you can't write to a particular standard, it doesn't have to be perfect, but to a particular standard, then I think you've deprived yourself of some of your education. That's all and I know, you know, like maybe I'm being slightly idealistic there, but I think you've deprived yourself of something. So, but I can certainly understand why you would do it if you have to produce a text quickly too. I understand that. So yeah, I don't really know if I'm giving the answer, but you want, but that's sort of how I feel a little bit. Kirill, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts because I'm a grumpy old man as well. I agree with you, Nicole. In terms of Mengli, you were going to respond, but I'm just saying, I think, I teach literature as well. And one of the things that I demand of my students is not to use AI, because in literature, it's not only about grammar, it's about learning to use your own voice and, you know, to adopt your own tone. I mean, because one of the things that's, I mean, I on the one hand, I teach communication, and it's just you're allowed to use AI, and the submissions are all very generic. They all sound the same. I promise you, they all sound the same. Whereas in the literature students that aren't allowed to use it will write something that's really quite wonderful, even if it's not up to the standard of that. Whether you can hear their voice, there's something unique in it, and that's really a nice thing to read. So I'm with Nicole on this. I get quite grumpy with my communication students, and I go, I can't read any more of this generic stuff, and I turn to those that unique voice. But Mengli, you, of course, over to you with something else.
I would say like I have a bit of comments and also like also some unsubtle issue with the use of AI at the same time. So earlier you said that we as the alumni of Australian Award recipient, and at least we have some background knowledge of maybe our English in other words is functionable, because we even like go through IELTS TOEFL test before we was actually awarded a scholarship, and I couldn't agree with that more. But I think when it's come to your literature review, I think I don't know that just to the best of my knowledge, I also require some literature on the use of AI in education, and some of them they are in favor of efficiency. Like I mean, like the need to like get the work done fast. It's not that we don't want to use our English, but we still can, but like at the expense of our like mental activity, thinking like it's gonna cost more. And some research they even say like, okay, if you could allocate that mental resource to think about how to innovate your insight, it would be better than having to handle the language. You got what I mean? I also have hands-on experience. I think this is not in research, but something I observe is pretty promising in the field, and maybe we have to reframe the way language education is happening. I used to work at a newspaper institution, like, because I myself don't speak English as my first language. So no matter how confidently I wrote the article, it have to be sent to the native speaker for copy editing or sometimes refining the ideas. And right now I see like personally I see ChatGPT and other Gen AI as having that capacity to help us. Like, but when it come to really come to the honesty in handling it, I believe like our intellectual, our verification skill really matter. I personally have been a student and also a teacher at the moment, and I feel like, especially at the bachelor degree, where students have no have still little idea about what it means academic literacy, academic honesty. When we introduce these tools so early, I think want it or not, they pretty much prone to cheating and sometimes like misconduct in the use. So I think this becomes something I feel is unsubtle, stay unsubtle nowadays. And
Yeah.
about what DB mentioned earlier, Thai 1, Thai 2, and Thai 3, I don't know what the methodology that they use to really come up with that framework. Like, is it based on tested or untested experience, or based on just like general observation of it? Like, should we
Oh.
need more tested experience to prove that? Because like
Mm.
from my observation, like most it's the assumption, in other words, like we don't have really clearly tested experience yet.
Mm. Well, as far as I can say, the framework is based on research. Actually, they have actually conducted interview, but also even used AI to AI prompts to to produce text and scrutinize those texts. So it's methodologically it seems rigorous. That's what I can say about the one. But the I mean, I don't disagree with what you said, but my reading of this phenomena, the way it's unfolding, is that and this is the sort of seems like a growing consensus among the community of scholars, is that you can use AI just as a research assistant, but it cannot really replace the human creativity and human rationality. It cannot really replace a researcher. So you can use it as a research assistant. In that sense, you actually verify the text, scrutinize the informations, you take control of accountability of what has been produced and what you are going to use from it, and you are also being very transparent about the process, the limitations, and the extent which AI as your research assistance was used. That's what I can say at this stage. But as I said, this is an evolving issue. Even universities sometimes seems to be, working out on their strategies to deal with these things, and this is a rapidly growing phenomena. So we can possibly have more conversations around that in our in-person meeting, how much we can or we cannot use AI, especially from ethical point of view, because the emphasis of our presentation and talks today is basically from the lens of ethics and integrity. Okay. Right. There are two more questions, I think. Sorry, we are already 3 minutes over the time. Is it okay if we take another 4 or 5 minutes to wrap up everything? Is that okay for everyone? Or we want to just close here? Very quickly, how to raise awareness of ethical use of AI for research? I don't know, honestly. I don't know. Maybe discussing something in a training like this, but I don't know. Any thoughts on this, colleagues?
Well, I suppose we're kind of doing it, but
Yeah.
we're also we're raising awareness of it. I don't think we're actually coming out and saying no. I mean, yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because
but I think, I mean, more research on this issue, AI. I mean, interestingly, when I started looking at the literature in the past 2-3 years, there are now papers in good journals, peer-reviewed journals, that are coming out talking about the ethical and integrity issues in relation to the use of AI. There is more literature now than it used to be a couple of years before. So certainly this has been subjects that's being discussed, debate, both in policy and academic circles. So I hope that's probably going to help in the future. That's what.
Can I say two things? One, I think increasingly as part of the ethics process, we're going to be asked how we're using AI, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is the way that we will raise, the ethics process is a little behind where the practice is. But for example, now in my course, and I'm assuming Kirill and DB have similar things in place, we have, for all our teaching, we have to integrate input from the students explaining how they've used AI for their research, for their essays, for example, whether that's an interview, whether that's a written statement, whether, we build some training into the preparation, preparing our students in terms of how they approach their essays and how to integrate it, so we instruct them how to integrate it. And it's interesting. I'm always encouraged, actually. I find there's a really hard group of students everywhere that just basically say, no, I'm not using it because I'm scared my brain will stop working if I start to rely on it too heavily. So I think that's really interesting too. There's some resistance from students, but they're young. You know, that may change with time, and particularly with time pressure. I think Menli makes a very good point about the idea that AI is efficient. But Carol's point is also really important. It may be efficient, but we also need to ask ourselves what we lose. And we may lose credibility, as DB shows, because AI is, I learned a phrase the other day that's really stayed with me. AI is primed to please. So it wants you to give you the result you're looking for. And the problem is it's so primed to please, it actually makes up stuff. And that's what I tell my students. It makes up stuff. So in my area, particularly gender studies, it's pretty easy for me to tell when I'm reading an AI essay because it just makes up things that don't exist and facts that don't exist. But I do think from an ethics point of view, we're going to be asked more and more how we've used AI. And then the determination is, well, have you used AI ethically? Whose work is it, right? But then the other point is about the creativity. I'm not in this game to produce. I'm always interested in research because it gives me the opportunity to be creative. And I don't think AI is at all creative, as Carol says. AI just reproduces the safe paradigm. And I've never been interested in producing research that just tells people what they already know. I'm only interested in producing research that's innovative. So for me, you know, there may be, if I have to find out, you know, what a document says, or, you know, say, for example, I want to look at a whole range of UN Security Council resolutions and I want to know which ones talk about climate change. I have used AI for that. Do I trust the results? No, I go back and look at the source documents because I don't at all believe, but it gives me a starting point, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, you know, I think I think there will be greater checks and balances built into the research process. But I also think, you know, Kirill's point really spoke to me. What do we lose? What do we lose by using these technologies from the creativity of our research process and what we love about doing research, you know, if we have the privilege to do it? Anyway, I actually am super excited about discussing this more when we get all together in Cambodia soon. Perhaps we should wrap up now because we're heading into 10 past. You know, in a couple of minutes. Would it be all right if I just sort of said a couple of final things? And that is, we've got our last online session next week, which I'm not sure I'm going to be at. I think DB or Kirill might be leading. I might come in just for a little bit. But I think it would be really important for us to also start thinking about the things that you would like us to touch on further for the in-person session. So we've got some ideas, but it's important for us. If you want more on a particular issue, it would be important for us to hear about that. So perhaps what we can do is set up some kind of Padlet or something, and we'll maybe get Mwani to prepare that, and we'll just make a space where you can write into the Padlet, which is like an online whiteboard, some issues that you want us to discuss, and we can prepare some, if we can, some lessons on those. We're also going to be asking you to, between when we wrap up next week and our online meeting, to start thinking about writing your research proposals for that you will submit at the end of this process, as sort of a little assessment task or a participation task. They don't have to be long, but just start thinking about what that might look like. We will make time in the in-person training as well for you to work on those and get more guidance on those. But start thinking about that, right? Because that's something that we hope you'll be able to submit at the conclusion of the in-person training. So that's all I wanted to say to wrap up. I might just hand it back to Kirill and DB if they want to say anything as well.
No, just maybe DB will start with the exercise next week just to get some. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Because it'll still have some applicability, and then we'll move on to
Academic writing, yeah, the writing part. Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, Kirill. Yeah, sorry, I took your time.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
It's
but I think the exercise looks very exciting, interesting. So that let's keep it for next week. And I think Kim Sans has already left because he has to go to launch meeting. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone. So we have one more online session to go, which is next week. We'll see you next week, and then. Yeah, until then, thank you. Have a nice day and lovely weekend. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicole.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Kirill. Thank you, Moani. Everyone, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.